Welcome aboard and thank you for joining the channel. Today we drift into the harsh and unforgiving world of the 1800s sea where wooden warships ruled the oceans, storms could swallow entire fleets, and the life of a naval captain was far more dangerous than most people imagine. From brutal storms and deadly battles to disease, mutiny, and the crushing weight of command, being a captain wasn't a glamorous adventure. It was a relentless test of courage, judgment, and survival. Every decision could mean the difference between victory and disaster, between bringing your crew home safely or losing everything to the sea. So sit back, relax, and prepare to step aboard a world where the ocean shows no mercy. And before we begin, don't forget to like the video, subscribe to the channel, and turn on notifications so you never miss another journey into the fascinating and often brutal stories of history. Imagine waking before sunrise to the violent rocking of a wooden warship. The sound is the first thing you notice, not the wind or the waves, but the constant groaning of timber as the ship strains against the sea. Every plank, every beam, every rope seems alive with motion. The hull creaks like an old door forced open by the wind, and somewhere above you the rigging whistles as the cold morning air cuts through the sails. Your narrow cabin is dark, cramped, and damp. The walls sweat with moisture. The air smells of salt, wet wood, tar, and the lingering scent of gunpowder that never truly leaves a naval vessel. Outside, beyond the thick wooden walls of the ship, the ocean stretches endlessly in every direction. No land, no harbor, no escape. You push yourself upright from the small cot bolted to the floor. Even that simple movement reminds you that the ship never truly rests. It sways slowly from side to side like a living creature breathing beneath you. A lantern swings from a hook above your desk, casting long shadows that stretch and shrink with every roll of the hull. Maps are spread across the table, their edges curled from damp air and constant use. A compass sits beside them, along with instruments that determine where you are, in a world that offers no landmarks, only sky and water. You are not a passenger here. You are not a sailor simply following orders. You are the captain. At first glance, that title sounds powerful. In stories and paintings, naval captains are often shown standing proudly on the deck of magnificent ships, gazing out across the horizon as their crews obey every command. The uniform, the authority, the respect, it all seems like the life of a hero. A captain commands hundreds of sailors and controls a warship that carries dozens of cannons capable of destroying enemy vessels with thunderous force. In port cities, captains were admired figures. Their ships represented the strength of their nation, and their successes brought honor and glory. But that image hides the truth, because once your ship leaves the safety of harbor and the coastline disappears behind the horizon, the reality of command begins to reveal itself. The moment you step onto the deck, every life aboard the ship becomes your responsibility. Hundreds of men depend on your judgment. Sailors, officers, gunners, carpenters, surgeons, cooks, every one of them lives or dies based on the choices you make. A captain cannot simply give orders and walk away. Every command carries consequences that ripple through the ship like waves through water. If you choose the wrong course, the ship may sail into dangerous waters. If you misjudge the weather, the crew may face a storm they cannot survive. If you underestimate an enemy vessel, the battle that follows could destroy everything you are sworn to protect. The ocean offers no forgiveness for mistakes. And the most terrifying part is that once you leave land behind, there is no one else to rely on. No superior officer standing nearby to advise you. No government officials ready to intervene. Communication across oceans takes weeks or months. By the time orders from distant admirals arrive, the situation they describe may already be long past. Out here, the captain is the final authority. You are judge, leader, strategist, and guardian of the ship all at once. That power may sound impressive, but it also carries a crushing weight that few people today can truly imagine. Even before the sun rises, your day has already begun. The ship never sleeps, and neither can you. Somewhere high above the deck, a lookout stands in the crow's nest scanning the horizon for sails or danger. Sailors climb the rigging in the dim light of dawn, adjusting ropes and canvas as the wind shifts. Below deck, men prepare food for the crew while others pump water from the bilge to keep the vessel from slowly filling with seawater. And all of it happens under your command. When you step out of your cabin and onto the deck, the cool sea air hits your face. The horizon glows faintly as the first light of dawn spreads across the water. The sea might look calm in that moment, but any experienced sailor knows that calm seas can change quickly. A peaceful morning can turn into a nightmare by afternoon. Your officers greet you respectfully, but behind their discipline lies expectation. They rely on your judgment just as much as the sailors below rely on theirs. A captain must appear confident at all times, even if you are unsure of what lies ahead. Because doubt is dangerous on a ship. Sailors watch their captain closely. They listen to the tone of your voice, the certainty of your commands, the calmness of your movements. If they sense fear or hesitation, that feeling spreads quickly through the crew. And fear at sea can destroy discipline faster than any enemy. So you speak clearly. You give orders with authority. You stand tall even when exhaustion pulls at your shoulders and the uncertainty of the open ocean weighs on your mind. But confidence does not erase the dangers that surround you. Wooden ships in the 1800s were incredibly complex machines, yet fragile in ways that might surprise modern observers. The entire structure depended on carefully shaped timbers held together by bolts, nails, and ropes. Every sail had to be trimmed correctly. Every rope had to be maintained. Every mast had to withstand the tremendous force of wind and waves. If something failed, the consequences could be immediate and deadly. A snapped mast might crash onto the deck, crushing sailors beneath tons of wood and rigging. A torn sail could leave the ship unable to maneuver in dangerous waters. Even a small leak in the hull could grow into a life-threatening problem if not repaired quickly. And as captain, every problem eventually reaches you. Officers report damaged rigging. The carpenter warns of weakening beams. The surgeon informs you of illness spreading among the crew. The navigator brings new calculations that suggest your current course may be wrong. Each piece of information demands a decision. Sometimes those decisions must be made within seconds. And every decision carries the risk of being wrong. The ocean does not provide clear answers. Weather changes without warning. Currents push ships away from their intended paths. Clouds hide the stars that navigators rely on to determine their position. Even experienced captains sometimes feel as though they are guiding their ships through a world of uncertainty. But uncertainty does not excuse failure. Back on land, governments expect results. Admirals expect obedience. Merchants expect their cargo to arrive safely. A nation's enemies expect resistance. If something goes wrong, the captain will be the one held responsible. That knowledge follows you constantly. When you walk the deck, when you study maps, when you listen to the wind and the sails, you know that every moment at sea is a test of your leadership. Even small details demand attention. The crew must be fed and disciplined. Supplies must be rationed carefully so they last the entire voyage. Fresh water must be protected because once it runs out, survival becomes nearly impossible. Sailors argue, grow homesick, become sick or injured, and sometimes lose their will to work. Maintaining order among hundreds of men living in cramped conditions is one of the captain's most difficult tasks. Because while the sea is dangerous, a crew without discipline can be even more dangerous. You must balance authority with fairness. Too much cruelty can breed resentment. Too much leniency can invite chaos. Finding that balance requires constant awareness of the crew's morale and behavior. And all of this responsibility begins the moment the ship leaves harbor. Imagine watching the coastline slowly fade as your vessel sails toward the open sea. Families and friends wave from the docks until distance turns them into tiny shapes against the land. Eventually, even the land itself disappears, replaced by an endless horizon. For the crew, this moment marks the beginning of adventure or hardship. For the captain, it marks the beginning of isolation. Because no matter how many sailors surround you, command separates you from them. You cannot show weakness. You cannot share every fear or doubt. Leadership requires distance as well as authority. While the crew sleeps in crowded hammocks below deck, you remain awake studying maps and planning the next stage of the journey. While sailors laugh and gamble during their brief moments of rest, your mind remains focused on wind patterns, navigation, and the unpredictable dangers ahead. Responsibility follows you even into the quietest hours of the night. And sometimes, when the ship is silent except for the creak of wood and the soft rush of waves against the hull, the weight of that responsibility becomes impossible to ignore. Because out here, far from land, there are no second chances. If a mistake is made, there may be no rescue. If a storm destroys the ship, the ocean will claim every soul aboard. If a battle goes wrong, the crew may perish beneath enemy cannon fire. And history may never even record what happened. This is the reality behind the title of naval captain in the 1800s. Not just authority, not just honor, but endless responsibility carried across the most dangerous environment on earth. And for many who accepted that responsibility, The journey that began with pride and ambition would end in a struggle simply to keep their ship and their crew alive on the unforgiving sea. The authority of a naval captain in the 1800s might appear impressive to anyone looking at it from the outside. Standing on the quarterdeck in a crisp uniform, giving commands that hundreds of sailors obey instantly, a captain seemed almost like a king of the sea. Every rope adjusted, every sail raised, every cannon fired happened under his direction. To observers in port cities, this authority looked like power and prestige. People imagined captains as fearless leaders commanding great wooden ships across the vast oceans of the world. But behind that image was a reality that few truly understood. Because the authority of a captain did not feel like freedom. It felt like pressure. Every single decision carried consequences that could follow a man for the rest of his life. The moment a captain accepted command of a ship, he also accepted responsibility for everything that happened on that vessel. Not just the success of a mission, but the safety of every sailor aboard. Every rope that snapped, every leak in the hull, every injury, every lost battle, these were not just unfortunate events. They were problems that would eventually be traced back to the captain. And if something went wrong, the world expected someone to blame. That someone was almost always the captain. Unlike modern commanders who have layers of communication, technology, and advisors supporting them, captains in the 1800s often made decisions with limited information. Once a ship sailed beyond sight of land, the captain was effectively isolated from the government or navy that sent him there. Orders from admirals might arrive months after they were written. By the time those orders reached the ship, the situation might already be completely different. Storms may have forced the ship to change course. Enemy fleets may have moved to new waters. Supplies may have run low, forcing unexpected stops at distant ports. Yet despite these uncertainties, captains were still expected to carry out their missions successfully. Failure was rarely excused. Imagine the weight of knowing that every decision you make might later be judged by officials who were not there to witness the dangers you faced. A captain could navigate through weeks of violent storms, survive disease outbreaks among the crew, and still face punishment if the final outcome of the mission did not meet expectations. Naval authorities were strict about discipline and responsibility. Ships were expensive national assets, often carrying valuable cargo or representing the military strength of an empire. Losing a ship was not just a personal failure. It could damage a nation's power and reputation. So when ships were lost, investigations followed, and those investigations could destroy careers. Court-martials were the ultimate fear for many captains. A court-martial was not simply a meeting or a discussion about what went wrong. It was a formal military trial where officers examined every decision the captain made during the voyage or battle. Witnesses were called. Logs were studied. Officers and sailors might testify about the captain's actions. Every order given during a crisis could be questioned. If the court decided the captain acted recklessly, cowardly, or incompetently, the punishment could be severe. Some captains were dismissed from service, losing their rank and their reputation forever. Others were imprisoned. In the worst cases, a captain could even face execution if his actions were believed to have endangered the ship or disobeyed critical orders. This harsh system existed because navies depended on discipline and accountability. Ships were often far from home waters, and captains needed strong authority to maintain control over their crews. But that same system also meant that captains lived with constant fear of failure. Even when everything seemed to be going well, uncertainty remained. The ocean itself created endless risks that no captain could fully control. Consider the simple act of choosing a route across the sea. Today, ships travel along carefully mapped paths supported by satellites and advanced navigation systems. But in the early 1800s, many parts of the world's oceans were still poorly mapped. Hidden reefs, shallow sandbars, and dangerous coastlines could appear suddenly, especially in unfamiliar waters. A captain had to rely on charts that were sometimes outdated or inaccurate. If those charts were wrong, disaster could strike without warning. Running aground was one of the most humiliating and dangerous failures a captain could face. A grounded ship might break apart under the force of waves crashing against it. Even if the vessel survived, the crew could become stranded in hostile territory far from rescue. And if investigators later determined that the captain's navigation caused the accident, the consequences could follow him forever. Because of this, captains constantly questioned their own decisions. Was the course correct? Were the charts accurate? Was the ship drifting too close to shallow water? Even a small error in navigation could place the vessel miles away from its intended position. Those miles could mean the difference between open water and a deadly reef. The responsibility did not end with navigation. Every aspect of the ship's operation fell under the captain's authority. Food supplies had to be managed carefully. A long voyage required months of provisions, and miscalculating those supplies could lead to starvation. Fresh water was even more critical. Barrels of water were stored below deck, but they could become contaminated or leak during rough seas. If water supplies ran out before reaching land, the situation could quickly become desperate. The captain had to ensure rations were distributed properly so that supplies lasted the entire journey. But rationing created its own problems. Hungry sailors became angry sailors. If the crew believed the captain was unfair or careless with supplies, resentment could begin to grow. And resentment aboard a ship was dangerous. Because the captain's authority depended not only on rank, but also on the crew's willingness to obey. A naval vessel might carry 200 or more sailors. Most of them lived in cramped conditions below deck, sleeping in hammocks packed tightly together. Their days were filled with exhausting labor climbing rigging, hauling ropes, cleaning the ship, and maintaining equipment. Life at sea was physically demanding and often miserable. The captain had to maintain discipline among men who were tired, hungry, and far from home. Punishments for breaking rules were severe. Flogging with the cat's 9 tails was a common punishment for disobedience, theft, drunkenness, or fighting. The whip's 9 knotted cords tore into a sailor's back with each strike, leaving scars that could last a lifetime. These punishments were intended to maintain order, but they also created tension. A captain who punished sailors too harshly could create hatred among the crew. A captain who was too lenient could lose control of the ship. Balancing these extremes required careful judgment, and judgment had to be applied constantly. Every officer looked to the captain for guidance. Every sailor expected leadership. Even small conflicts between crew members could grow into larger problems if ignored. The captain had to be aware of everything happening aboard the ship. This awareness required constant attention and mental endurance. Long voyages meant months of responsibility without relief. There were no vacations at sea, no weekends away from duty. Even when the captain slept, he remained responsible for whatever happened during the night. A sudden storm could require immediate action. An unexpected sail appearing on the horizon could signal an enemy ship. In those moments, the crew expected their captain to respond instantly. Fatigue did not excuse hesitation. This constant pressure wore down even the strongest leaders. Some captains developed reputations for strict discipline because they believed harsh control was the only way to maintain order. Others tried to inspire loyalty by treating their sailors with fairness and respect. But regardless of their leadership style, every captain faced the same burden. The ship's success or failure rested on their shoulders, and sometimes that burden became overwhelming. Consider the moments just before a naval battle. A lookout spots sails in the distance. Officers examine the horizon through spyglasses, trying to determine whether the approaching ship is friend or enemy. If the vessel is hostile, the captain must decide what to do. Should the ship engage in battle? Should it attempt to escape? Should it pursue the enemy? Each choice carries risk. If the captain chooses to fight and loses, lives will be lost and the ship may be destroyed. If the captain chooses to retreat, he may later face accusations of cowardice. And those accusations could lead straight to a court-martial. This is the terrible dilemma captains often faced. They were expected to be both cautious and brave, both strategic and aggressive, both protective of their crew and determined to achieve victory. Satisfying all of those expectations at once was nearly impossible. Yet the world expected captains to do exactly that. And when they failed, history rarely remembered the difficult choices they faced. It only remembered the outcome: a lost battle, a shipwreck, a failed mission. Behind every one of those outcomes was a captain who had carried the enormous weight of command across an unpredictable ocean. A man who made decisions in moments of uncertainty, knowing that those decisions might later be judged by people who had never experienced the dangers of life at sea. That was the true burden of command for naval captains in the 1800s. Not just authority, but responsibility so heavy that a single mistake could destroy a lifetime of service. And once a ship sailed beyond the horizon, that responsibility belonged to one man alone. For a naval captain in the 1800s, the ocean was not just a highway connecting distant lands. It was a vast, unpredictable wilderness where even the smallest mistake could turn a routine voyage into a disaster. Today, ships travel with extraordinary accuracy. Modern captains rely on satellite navigation, radar, and detailed digital charts that can pinpoint a vessel's exact location within meters. But in the early 19th century, none of those technologies existed. The world's oceans were still mysterious and poorly mapped in many places, and navigation depended on skill, patience, and instruments that required careful interpretation. A captain standing on the deck of a wooden ship had only the sky, the sea, and a few delicate tools to guide him across thousands of miles of open water. The most basic instrument was the compass. It pointed toward magnetic north, allowing sailors to maintain a general direction during a voyage. But a compass alone could not tell a captain exactly where his ship was located. It could only indicate which way the ship was pointing. Without knowing the ship's precise position, simply sailing in the correct direction was not enough. Currents, winds, and storms could push a vessel far away from its intended course without the crew realizing it for days or even weeks. To determine their position, sailors relied on a process known as celestial navigation. This method involved measuring the angles of the sun, moon, or stars above the horizon and comparing those measurements with detailed tables and calculations. The instrument used for these measurements was called a sextant. It was a delicate metal device with mirrors and scales that allowed navigators to determine the angle between a celestial body and the horizon. Using a sextant required clear skies and a steady hand. Even then, the measurement was only the beginning of a complicated process. The navigator had to record the exact time of the observation using a chronometer, a highly precise clock designed for sea travel. Then he had to consult thick books of tables and perform mathematical calculations to estimate the ship's latitude and longitude. Latitude, which measures distance north or south of the equator, was relatively easier to determine. Longitude, measuring east or west position, was much more difficult. For centuries, sailors struggled to calculate longitude accurately, and errors could place a ship dozens or even hundreds of miles from its estimated location. Even by the early 1800s, when chronometers improved navigation greatly, the process remained complicated and vulnerable to mistakes. A small error in measuring the angle of the sun, a slightly inaccurate clock, or a miscalculation in the tables could produce a false position on the chart, and that false position could lead a ship directly into danger. Imagine sailing across open ocean for weeks, believing you are safely far from land. Your charts indicate nothing but deep water for hundreds of miles in every direction. Then suddenly, without warning, the lookout shouts from the mast that waves are breaking ahead. Hidden beneath the surface lies a reef. The ship may have only minutes before it strikes. Reefs were among the greatest fears of captains during this era. Many reefs were poorly mapped or completely unknown to European navigators. Some lurked just below the water's surface, invisible until waves broke against them. A large wooden ship traveling at speed could smash against coral or rock with tremendous force. The hull would split open. Water would rush inside. Within minutes, the vessel could be doomed. Even if the crew managed to abandon the ship, they might find themselves stranded on a remote island or drifting in small boats with limited supplies. Stories of such disasters filled naval records and sailors' memories. Ships vanished in tropical waters where coral reefs formed deadly mazes beneath the waves. Others wrecked along rocky coastlines where strong currents pushed vessels toward cliffs and hidden shoals. Captains studied charts constantly to avoid these dangers, but charts were not always reliable. Many were based on earlier voyages where sailors had recorded observations under difficult conditions. A reef might be marked in the wrong location. A coastline might be drawn inaccurately. Entire islands were sometimes misplaced by dozens of miles. Navigating through unfamiliar waters required extreme caution. When approaching a coastline, captains often reduced the ship's speed and ordered sailors to take soundings. This involved lowering a weighted rope called a sounding line into the water to measure depth. The sailor handling the line would call out the depth as the weight touched the seabed. These measurements helped determine whether the ship was approaching shallow water. But sounding lines had limitations. They could only measure depth directly beneath the ship, not what lay ahead. A sudden underwater cliff or reef might appear without warning. Nighttime made navigation even more dangerous. Without sunlight, sailors could not use a sextant to measure the sun's position. Cloudy skies could hide the stars, making celestial navigation impossible. In such conditions, captains relied on dead reckoning, a method of estimating position based on the ship's speed, direction, and time traveled. Dead reckoning involved constant guesswork. The navigator would estimate how fast the ship was moving, how the wind affected its path, and how ocean currents might push it off course. Over time, small errors accumulated. After several days without accurate observations, the ship's estimated position might differ greatly from its true location. Sailing blindly across the ocean with only rough estimates of position was extremely stressful. Captains often worried constantly that they might be drifting toward unseen hazards. Even when the ocean appeared calm and empty, danger could lurk below the surface. Currents were another unpredictable factor that complicated navigation. Powerful ocean currents could push ships hundreds of miles away from their intended routes. Some currents flowed steadily across entire oceans, while others changed direction depending on winds and seasons. Captains had to understand these currents and adjust their courses accordingly. But knowledge of ocean currents was incomplete. Sailors learned through experience and shared knowledge, but every voyage brought new surprises. Sometimes currents carried ships into regions where winds behaved differently, forcing captains to alter their plans. Other times currents dragged vessels toward coastlines faster than expected. Storms made everything worse. Strong winds could push a ship far off course while preventing navigators from taking accurate measurements. Heavy clouds blocked the sun and stars, leaving the crew uncertain of their position for days. After a storm passed, captains often discovered that their ship had been carried many miles away from its intended route. Correcting that error required careful calculations and new observations, but until those measurements were taken, the ship might be sailing through unknown waters. And all the while the captain bore responsibility for guiding the vessel safely. If the ship ran aground because of navigational errors, the captain would face the consequences. This knowledge weighed heavily on every decision. Imagine standing on the deck at night, staring into darkness while the ship moves steadily forward. The wind fills the sails. Waves crash against the hull. Somewhere beneath the black water could be rocks sharp enough to tear the ship apart. You must trust your charts and calculations. But what if they are wrong? This uncertainty haunted many captains. They knew that even skilled navigators sometimes made mistakes. Fatigue could affect calculations. Poor weather could prevent accurate observations. Instruments might be damaged or slightly inaccurate. A tiny error at the beginning of a voyage could grow into a massive mistake weeks later. And when disaster struck, it often happened suddenly. The lookout might shout a warning just seconds before impact. Sailors would rush to turn the ship, but large vessels could not change direction instantly. The grinding crash of wood against rock would echo across the water. The hull would shudder violently. Water would begin pouring inside. In those moments the captain had to act quickly. Orders would be shouted across the deck. Sailors might attempt to lighten the ship by throwing cargo overboard. Pumps would be manned to remove incoming water. Boats would be prepared in case evacuation became necessary. But sometimes there was nothing anyone could do. The ship might break apart under the pounding of waves. And when investigators later examined the wreck, the captain's navigation would be scrutinized carefully. Did he miscalculate the ship's position? Did he ignore warnings from his navigator? Did he sail too close to dangerous waters? Even if the disaster resulted from inaccurate charts or unexpected currents, the captain could still face blame, because the captain was responsible for the safety of the ship. This reality made navigation one of the most stressful aspects of command. Every sunrise and sunset required careful observation of the sky. Every change in wind direction demanded attention. Every unfamiliar coastline had to be approached with caution. The captain could never relax completely. Even during peaceful voyages, the possibility of navigational error remained. Yet despite all these challenges, naval captains successfully crossed vast oceans, explored distant regions, and carried out complex missions around the world. Their ability to navigate using little more than mathematics, observation, and experience was remarkable. But it required constant concentration and enormous responsibility. Because in the age of wooden ships and wind-powered travel, the ocean offered no clear roads or signs to follow. Only endless water, shifting winds, and the quiet expectation that the captain would somehow guide his ship safely through it all. For sailors and captains in the 1800s, the sea could appear calm and beautiful one moment and become a terrifying force of destruction the next. Standing on the deck of a wooden ship during a peaceful morning, the ocean might look harmless. Gentle waves rolled beneath the hull, the wind filled the sails, and the ship moved steadily across the water as seabirds circled above. The horizon stretched endlessly, glowing with sunlight as if the world itself were calm and welcoming. But every experienced captain knew that this calm could vanish without warning. The ocean was unpredictable, and storms were among the most feared dangers of life at sea. Unlike modern ships that rely on advanced weather forecasts, satellites, and communication systems, Sailors in the 1800s had very little warning before a storm arrived. A captain could study the sky and observe subtle signs in the wind or clouds, but the ocean often hid its worst moods until they were already approaching. Sometimes the first sign of trouble appeared as a distant wall of dark clouds rising along the horizon. The wind might shift suddenly, becoming stronger and colder. The sea, which moments earlier seemed calm, would begin to swell with larger waves. Experienced captains recognized these signs immediately. They knew that once a storm began, controlling the ship would become a desperate struggle. The first step in preparing for bad weather was reducing sail. Large ships carried enormous sails that captured wind to propel the vessel forward. In calm weather these sails were essential for speed and maneuverability, but during a storm they became dangerous. Too much sail could cause the wind to push the ship violently to one side. The vessel might tilt so far that water flooded the deck. In extreme cases the ship could capsize entirely. So sailors rushed into the rigging, climbing high above the deck along ropes and wooden ladders. These men worked dozens of meters above the sea while the ship rocked beneath them. They had to gather and secure the sails quickly before the wind grew too strong. This was incredibly dangerous work. Strong gusts could throw sailors from the rigging, sending them plunging into the ocean below. Others might lose their grip as the mast swayed violently. Yet despite the danger, the crew had to work fast, because storms did not wait. As the wind strengthened, waves began to grow. The gentle rolling motion of the ship turned into heavy, unpredictable movements. The bow crashed into rising swells while water sprayed across the deck. Soon the sky darkened completely. Rain fell in sheets so thick that sailors could barely see one another across the deck. Thunder echoed across the ocean while lightning illuminated towering waves that seemed like moving mountains of water. During these moments, the captain could not retreat to his cabin. He had to remain on deck, directing every action. A naval captain during a storm became the center of the ship's survival. Officers shouted orders across the roaring wind, while sailors struggled with ropes and sails. Every command had to be precise and immediate. Should the ship turn into the wind? Should it run before the storm? Should more sails be lowered? These decisions were critical. Turning the ship in the wrong direction could expose the vessel to massive waves striking the side of the hull. When waves hit the side of a wooden ship with enough force, they could roll it over or break its masts. On the other hand, pointing the ship directly into the wind could slow its movement so much that waves began crashing over the bow, flooding the deck. The captain had to judge wind direction, wave patterns, and the strength of the storm all at once. And these judgments often had to be made within seconds. Meanwhile, the ship itself was under enormous stress. Wooden vessels were strong but flexible structures. Their frames were designed to bend slightly as waves lifted and dropped the hull. But during severe storms, the force of the sea could push the ship far beyond what it was designed to endure. The sound of the vessel struggling against the storm was unforgettable. Timbers groaned loudly as the hull twisted. Ropes snapped tight under pressure. The masts creaked as wind pulled against the sails. To sailors it often sounded as if the ship itself were crying out in pain. Water poured across the deck as waves crashed over the bow. Barrels, ropes, and loose equipment slid violently from side to side. Sailors struggled to maintain their footing while gripping ropes and railings to avoid being thrown into the sea. Falling overboard during a storm was almost always fatal. The ocean was too rough to launch rescue boats, and a man in the water could disappear instantly among the waves. The captain watched all of this unfold while trying to maintain control. Even the smallest mistake could make the situation worse. For example, if a sail tore loose during high winds, it could whip across the rigging with tremendous force. Sailors might be injured or killed while trying to secure it. Worse still, the loose sail could destabilize the ship's balance. Masts were another major concern. These tall wooden structures held the sails and rigging that powered the ship. During storms they endured enormous strain as the wind pushed against the sails, and the ship rolled violently in the waves. If a mast snapped, it could crash onto the deck with devastating force. Heavy timbers and tangled ropes might trap sailors beneath them. Even worse, the broken mast could drag in the water beside the ship, pulling the vessel sideways and threatening to capsize it. Captains sometimes had to make a terrible decision in such situations. They might order sailors to cut away a damaged mast. This meant sacrificing part of the ship's ability to sail in order to save the rest of the vessel. Cutting away a mast required men to rush onto the deck with axes while waves crashed around them. They chopped through ropes and supports while the storm raged overhead. If they succeeded, the broken mast would fall into the sea and the ship might regain stability. But if they failed, the falling timbers could destroy parts of the deck or injure sailors nearby. All of these decisions fell upon the captain, and the storm did not allow time for hesitation. Storms could last for hours or even days. During that time, the captain often remained awake almost continuously. Officers took turns managing different tasks, but the final responsibility for every decision remained with the captain. Fatigue became a serious problem. A captain who had not slept for 2 days might struggle to think clearly. Yet he still had to evaluate the situation constantly and issue orders with confidence. Meanwhile, the crew faced exhaustion and fear. Sailors were soaked by rain and seawater, their clothes heavy and cold against their skin. Many had not eaten properly since the storm began. The violent motion of the ship caused seasickness, leaving some men weak and unable to work. Still, the ship required constant effort to survive. Pumps had to be operated to remove water entering the hull. Sails had to be adjusted repeatedly as the wind changed direction. Damaged ropes need repair. The captain watched over all of it. He also had to maintain morale. A crew that lost hope could stop working effectively. Fear might cause hesitation when quick action was needed. So even when the storm seemed overwhelming, the captain had to appear calm. He gave orders clearly and firmly. He moved across the deck with determination, showing the crew that the ship was still under control. This confidence was often the difference between survival and disaster. Eventually, if the ship endured long enough, the storm would begin to weaken. The wind slowed. The waves gradually shrank. Clouds broke apart, allowing sunlight to return to the ocean. When the storm finally passed, the ship often looked like a battlefield. Sails might be torn into ribbons. Ropes hung loose from the rigging. The deck could be littered with broken wood and equipment. Sailors examined the damage carefully. Sometimes the ship had survived with only minor problems. Other times the storm left the vessel barely seaworthy. Masts might be weakened. The hull could leak in several places. Supplies might be lost overboard. In the worst cases, sailors discovered that fellow crew members had been injured or killed during the storm. For the captain, the work did not end when the storm passed. Now came the task of repairing the ship and determining whether it could continue the voyage. Carpenters inspected the hull for cracks or leaks. Sailmakers began repairing damaged sails. Riggers climbed the masts to replace broken lines. All of this had to be organized and supervised, because another storm might appear at any time. This endless cycle of preparation, survival, and repair defined life at sea. Storms reminded every captain of a harsh truth. No matter how skilled a navigator or leader he might be, the ocean itself was always stronger. A captain could command sailors and direct the ship, but he could never truly control the sea. All he could do was guide the vessel through its fury and hope that his decisions were strong enough to carry everyone safely to calmer waters. Even if a captain successfully navigated the dangers of storms and avoided the hidden hazards of the sea, another set of threats waited constantly on the horizon. The oceans of the 1800s were not peaceful highways where ships simply passed one another and continued on their journeys. They were contested spaces filled with rival nations, privateers, pirates, and warships that could turn an ordinary voyage into a life-or-death struggle without warning. Naval warfare during this era was brutal, loud, chaotic, and deeply personal. Unlike modern naval battles fought with missiles from great distances, ships in the early 19th century had to come close enough for cannons to strike their targets directly. Two warships often sailed toward each other until they were only a few hundred meters apart. At that distance, the thunder of cannon fire shook the air and the deck beneath the sailors' feet. For a captain standing on the quarterdeck, the moment before a battle began was filled with tension. Through a spyglass, he might watch an enemy ship approaching slowly across the waves. Its sails swelled with wind just like his own. Its crew moved across the deck preparing for the same violent encounter. In those moments, the captain had to make a decision. Should he attack immediately? Should he maneuver for a better position? Should he attempt to escape if the enemy appeared stronger? Each option carried enormous risk. If he chose to fight and misjudge the enemy's strength, his ship could be destroyed. If he chose to retreat when victory might have been possible, he could later face accusations of cowardice. The crew looked to him for direction. Hundreds of men waited silently as the captain gave the order that would determine their fate. When battle finally began, the peaceful sound of waves vanished beneath the roar of cannons. Warships of the time carried dozens of heavy guns mounted along their sides. These cannons fired solid iron balls that weighed several kilograms. When fired, each cannon exploded with a flash of fire and smoke, launching the iron projectile across the water toward the enemy ship. If the cannonball struck the hull, the result was devastating. Wooden ships were strong, but they could not fully resist the force of iron shot traveling at high speed. The ball smashed through the planks, splintering wood and sending fragments flying across the deck and into the lower decks where sailors worked. Those splinters were often as deadly as the cannonball itself. Large pieces of wood tore through the air like knives, striking sailors with tremendous force. Men were injured or killed instantly by these flying shards. The noise of battle was overwhelming. Cannons fired again and again in rapid succession. Thick clouds of gunpowder smoke filled the air, making it difficult to see the enemy ship clearly. The smell of burned powder mixed with salt water and sweat, creating an atmosphere that felt suffocating. Sailors shouted orders and warnings while running between cannons, loading powder and shot as quickly as possible. Meanwhile, the enemy ship returned fire. Cannonballs slammed into the hull, tearing holes in the wooden walls. Some crashed across the deck, bouncing unpredictably and knocking sailors aside like rag dolls. The captain remained at his position on the quarterdeck. From there he could see the entire ship and direct the battle. Officers relayed his commands to the gun crews and sailors handling the sails. But standing on the quarterdeck also made him highly visible. Enemy gunners knew that eliminating the captain could cripple the ship's leadership. Without clear command, the crew might become confused or disorganized. So enemy sharpshooters often aimed directly at the officers. Some were stationed high in the rigging of their ships, armed with muskets. From those elevated positions they searched the opposing vessel for the distinctive uniforms of captains and lieutenants. A single musket shot could end the life of the man responsible for hundreds of sailors. Captains understood this danger, yet they could not hide below deck. Leadership required them to remain visible, giving orders and maintaining control during the chaos of battle. Beyond cannon fire, naval battles often involved another terrifying tactic: boarding. If one ship managed to pull alongside another, sailors could throw grappling hooks to lock the vessels together. Then armed crews would rush across the gap between ships, climbing onto the enemy deck to fight hand-to-hand. Boarding battles were savage. Sailors fought with cutlasses, pistols, axes, and pikes. The narrow decks became scenes of intense combat as men struggled to overpower their opponents. The captain had to decide whether to attempt boarding or defend against it. Allowing the enemy crew onto the deck could lead to the loss of the ship entirely. But attempting boarding yourself was also dangerous, because it required bringing your vessel dangerously close to enemy guns. In every case, the captain's decisions shaped the outcome of the battle. If the battle ended in victory, the ship might capture the enemy vessel and its cargo. Such victories brought praise and sometimes financial rewards. But if the battle went poorly, the consequences were severe. Ships could be heavily damaged, leaving them vulnerable to sinking or further attacks. Crew members might be killed or wounded in large numbers. In the worst cases, the ship might surrender or be destroyed entirely. Even if the battle ended without disaster, the aftermath was grim. The surgeon and his assistants worked below deck in a cramped space that served as the ship's medical room. There, wounded sailors were treated with limited tools and supplies. Medical knowledge during this era was far less advanced than today. Amputations were common because shattered limbs from cannon injuries could rarely be repaired. The surgeon used saws and knives to remove damaged arms or legs, often while sailors were held down by their companions. The sounds of pain and the smell of blood filled the small room. And yet the captain could not focus only on the battle's immediate damage. The voyage still had to continue. War was not the only threat facing ships at sea. Disease was another relentless enemy. Living conditions aboard ships created the perfect environment for illness to spread. Hundreds of sailors lived close together in damp spaces below deck where fresh air was limited. Hammocks hung side by side so tightly that men could barely move between them. Hygiene was difficult to maintain. Water was precious and could not be wasted on regular bathing. Clothes remained damp from sea spray and sweat. Under these conditions, diseases spread rapidly. One of the most feared illnesses was scurvy. Scurvy developed when sailors lacked vitamin C, which is found in fresh fruits and vegetables. On long voyages, ships often carried salted meat, dried foods, and hard biscuits that could last for months. But these preserved foods contained little of the nutrients needed to prevent scurvy. After weeks without fresh produce, sailors began to experience symptoms. Their gums swelled and bled. Teeth loosened and fell out. Old wounds reopened as the body lost its ability to heal properly. Weakness spread through the crew as muscles deteriorated. In severe cases, sailors became too weak to stand or work. Eventually, scurvy could kill. Captains tried to prevent this by seeking fresh food whenever possible, stopping at ports to obtain fruits, vegetables, or citrus. But during long voyages across remote oceans, such opportunities were rare. Other diseases spread even more quickly. Dysentery caused severe stomach illness that weakened sailors rapidly. Typhus, spread by lice, created fever and exhaustion that could incapacitate large portions of the crew. Tropical waters introduced new threats such as yellow fever and malaria. A single infected sailor could unintentionally bring disease aboard, and within days the illness might spread throughout the ship. The captain watched these outbreaks with growing concern. If too many sailors became sick, the ship might not have enough healthy men to operate properly. Sails required strong hands to raise and lower them. Cannons needed trained crews. Repairs demanded skilled carpenters and riggers. A ship with a sick crew was dangerously vulnerable. Then there was the threat that haunted every captain's thoughts: mutiny. A naval vessel carried hundreds of sailors who endured exhausting labor, harsh discipline, poor food, and months or years away from home. If their frustration grew too strong, they might decide to rebel against their officers. Mutiny was rare but terrifying. Once a crew turned against its captain, control of the ship could change instantly. Sailors might seize weapons, overpower officers, and take command of the vessel themselves. History recorded several cases where captains were imprisoned by their own crews or set adrift in small boats. Some mutineers simply wanted to escape strict discipline and return home. Others were driven by anger toward harsh treatment or unfair punishments. To prevent such rebellions, captains had to maintain discipline carefully. Rules aboard naval ships were strict. Disobedience, theft, fighting, or drunkenness could lead to severe punishment. The most common punishment was flogging. A sailor sentenced to flogging was tied to a wooden frame or mast, while another sailor used the cat-o'-nine-tails, a whip with 9 knotted cords. Each lash tore into the skin, leaving painful wounds. By the time a captain had faced storms, navigated across dangerous waters, dealt with disease among the crew, and possibly fought in battle, another challenge remained, one that was less visible but often just as heavy. It was the quiet burden of leadership itself. Commanding a ship in the 1800s was not simply a matter of giving orders and watching sailors carry them out. It required constant emotional strength, self-control, and the ability to stand alone in moments when no one else could truly share the weight of responsibility. A naval captain was never just another man aboard the ship. From the moment he took command, he became something different in the eyes of the crew. To the sailors, the captain represented authority, discipline, and stability. His presence symbolized order on a vessel where hundreds of men lived and worked together in a small floating world surrounded by endless ocean. Every crew member depended on his leadership, whether they realized it or not. Because of that, the captain could never appear uncertain. Even when the situation looked hopeless, he had to project confidence. Imagine standing on the deck during a difficult voyage. The wind has shifted unexpectedly. The crew is exhausted after days of rough weather. Supplies are running low, and illness has begun spreading among the sailors below deck. Officers come to you with problems that require immediate solutions. At the same time, the horizon remains empty, offering no sign of land or friendly ships. In those moments, the crew watches the captain closely. If he looks worried or uncertain, sailors begin to whisper among themselves. Fear spreads quickly in such close quarters. A few worried voices can grow into widespread doubt about the ship's future. And doubt can be dangerous. When sailors begin to lose confidence in their leader, discipline weakens. Orders might be followed more slowly. Arguments could break out among the crew. The sense of unity that keeps the ship functioning begins to crack. That is why captains learn to hide their fear. Even when exhaustion filled their bodies and doubt filled their minds, they spoke calmly and gave orders with confidence. They walked across the deck as if everything was under control, even when the challenges ahead seemed overwhelming. This performance of strength was not easy. Many captains spent long nights alone in their cabins thinking through difficult decisions. Charts lay spread across their desks as they studied possible routes and tried to anticipate dangers that might lie ahead. A lantern flickered in the darkness while the ship creaked and rolled beneath them. Outside, the crew slept in crowded hammocks below deck. But the captain often remained awake. Sleep was never guaranteed. At any moment a lookout might shout from high in the rigging, "Sail on the horizon," and those 4 words could instantly change everything. A distant sail might belong to a merchant ship carrying valuable cargo. Capturing such a vessel could bring wealth and recognition, but the sail might also belong to an enemy warship. And if that enemy ship was stronger, faster, or better armed, the captain faced a difficult choice. Should he pursue and risk battle? Should he attempt to escape before the enemy closed the distance? Should he prepare the ship for combat and trust his crew to win? Every choice carried consequences. Choosing to attack could lead to victory, but it might also bring destruction. Choosing to flee might save the ship, but it could later bring accusations of cowardice from naval authorities. The captain had only minutes to decide. While he weighed the options, sailors rushed across the deck preparing the ship. Cannons were checked, sails adjusted. Officers waited for the final order. Then the captain spoke. The crew moved instantly to carry out his decision. This pattern repeated itself again and again throughout a captain's career. Moments of quiet routine followed by sudden bursts of urgent decision-making. Even during peaceful voyages, the captain's mind remained busy. He had to plan routes across thousands of miles of ocean, taking into account wind patterns and currents. He had to monitor supplies, ensuring that food and water lasted long enough to reach the next port. He had to maintain discipline while also keeping morale high among sailors who might not see their families for years. The emotional strain of this responsibility could be intense. Unlike the sailors who could sometimes laugh together, play games, or share stories during quiet moments, the captain often remained separate from the crew. This separation was necessary to maintain authority. A captain who became too familiar with his sailors risked weakening the chain of command. Discipline depended on the clear understanding that the captain's orders were final. So while the crew formed friendships and bonds below deck, the captain lived in a more isolated world. He spoke regularly with his officers, of course. Trusted lieutenants and navigators could provide advice and assistance. But even among officers, the captain remained the ultimate decision-maker, and that meant the final burden always returned to him. When something went wrong, the responsibility did not spread equally among the crew. It rested on the captain's shoulders. If the ship ran aground, it was the captain's failure. If the crew mutinied, it was the captain's leadership being questioned. If the ship lost a battle or failed to complete its mission, the captain's reputation suffered. For many captains, reputation was everything. Naval careers depended on honor and trust. A captain known for skill and bravery might receive new commands and opportunities for promotion. Successful voyages could bring recognition from admirals and government officials. But a single failure could end that career. Some captains returned home from disastrous voyages only to face investigations and trials. Their actions were examined by naval authorities who studied reports and questioned witnesses. Even if the captain had faced impossible circumstances, the judgment could still be harsh. Knowing this, captains carried constant pressure during every voyage. Yet despite all the dangers and difficulties, many men continued to accept command of ships. Why? Part of the answer was ambition. Commanding a ship represented one of the highest achievements in a naval career. For officers who had spent years rising through the ranks, becoming a captain meant recognition of their skill and dedication. But ambition alone was not enough to endure the hardships of command. Many captains also felt a deep sense of duty. Their ships represented their nation. Protecting trade routes, defending coastlines, and confronting enemy fleets were essential tasks in an era when sea power shaped the fate of empires. Captains understood that their leadership could influence battles, protect merchants, and safeguard their country's interests. This sense of purpose gave meaning to the long voyages and heavy responsibilities. Still, the risks remained constant. Ships disappeared into storms and were never seen again. Others were wrecked on distant shores where survivors struggled to reach safety. Some were lost in battle, their crews and captains swallowed by the sea. History remembers the famous victories and legendary admirals, but it often forgets the countless captains who fought daily struggles against wind, waves, illness, and uncertainty. For every celebrated hero, there were many others who spent years quietly guiding their ships through dangerous waters without recognition. They made difficult decisions, kept their crews alive, and delivered their vessels safely across oceans. Their success was measured not in glory, but in survival. When a voyage finally ended and the ship returned to port, the captain might feel a brief moment of relief. The crew stepped onto solid ground again. Supplies were replenished. Repairs began on the ship. Families reunited with sailors who had been away for months or years. But the captain knew that another voyage would eventually begin. Another journey into uncertain waters. Another test of leadership. And once the ship sailed beyond the horizon again, the familiar weight of command would return. Because on the open ocean, far from land and far from help, the captain remained the single person responsible for guiding an entire floating world through danger. That responsibility demanded courage, discipline, intelligence, and emotional strength every single day. Which is why, for someone suddenly placed in command of such a ship without preparation or experience, the challenge would be overwhelming. The storms, the navigation, the battles, the illness, the constant decisions, the loneliness of leadership, it all combined into a life few people today could imagine enduring. And that is why, if you somehow woke up one morning as the captain of a naval ship in the 1800s, surrounded by hundreds of sailors looking to you for guidance, as the endless ocean stretched in every direction, you probably would not last a single day. After surviving storms, navigating treacherous waters, facing disease, mutiny, and even battle, a naval captain in the 1800s still had one of the greatest challenges of all: the burden of long-term leadership and the constant mental strain that came with it. Commanding a ship was not a short-term role. Voyages could last months or even years. During that time, the captain was isolated from the world, far from friends, family, and the support networks that people on land could rely upon. The weight of responsibility was continuous, relentless, and personal. Every decision, every adjustment of the sails, every ration of food, every disciplinary action was a test of skill, judgment, and endurance. A captain's mind was constantly occupied. Even when the ship seemed to be moving smoothly through calm waters, the captain could not allow himself to relax. He had to anticipate potential dangers, evaluate the crew's condition, and ensure the ship's course would bring them to the intended destination safely. The ocean is vast, and while it may appear calm, it conceals countless hidden hazards: reefs, unpredictable currents, sudden weather changes. Even minor miscalculations could result in disaster hundreds of miles away from the nearest port. The captain was always calculating, always thinking, often far beyond the physical and mental endurance of his crew. While officers could assist with navigation, watch duties, and discipline, ultimate responsibility rested with the captain. He bore the consequences of failure alone. A misjudged course, a poorly timed maneuver, or a delay in responding to a threat could mean the loss of the ship and all aboard. Unlike on land, where leaders could consult colleagues, rely on communications, or delegate authority easily, the captain at sea often made split-second decisions with limited information. Each choice was fraught with risk, and each mistake could be fatal. In addition to external pressures, the internal challenges of maintaining authority weighed heavily. A captain could not simply be a figurehead. He had to inspire confidence, command respect, and manage the complex social hierarchy aboard a ship. Sailors came from diverse backgrounds, some experienced, others young and inexperienced. They brought with them different expectations, temperaments, and grievances. The captain needed to balance fairness with discipline, firmness with understanding. Too lenient, and order might collapse. Too strict, and resentment could fester, even leading to rebellion. The crew's obedience depended not just on fear but on respect, a delicate balance that required constant attention. This social management was especially challenging when disasters occurred. Storms, disease outbreaks, or accidents could test the crew's morale. Sailors could become fearful, anxious, or angry. In such moments, the captain needed to maintain calm, reassure the crew, and act decisively. Hesitation or visible doubt could spread panic quickly, while confident leadership could help steady even the most frightened sailors. The mental and emotional toll of maintaining composure under extreme stress was enormous. Long voyages also demanded meticulous planning. Supplies of food, water, and medicine had to be rationed carefully. Fresh water was limited, and spoiled provisions could quickly cause illness. Captains often had to make difficult decisions about rationing, balancing the health of the crew with the duration of the voyage. Any miscalculation could lead to scurvy, starvation, or dehydration. Ships carried only a fraction of the resources needed for long-term survival, so captains had to anticipate needs months in advance and adjust as conditions changed. Health crises were a constant worry. Sailors were vulnerable to diseases such as scurvy, dysentery, and typhus. These illnesses could strike suddenly and spread rapidly in the confined spaces below deck. The captain had to ensure proper hygiene, monitor the crew for signs of sickness, and coordinate with the ship's surgeon to care for the ill. Each death or severe illness weighed heavily on him, as every life aboard was his responsibility. Discipline and punishment added another layer of difficulty. Maintaining order on a ship with hundreds of men in close quarters required constant vigilance. Infractions ranged from minor disobedience to serious crimes like theft, fighting, or insubordination. Punishments could be harsh, including flogging, confinement, or extra duties. The captain had to apply discipline judiciously, ensuring fairness while maintaining authority. Misjudgment could undermine his control and, in the worst cases, lead to mutiny. Mutiny was a real and terrifying threat. The combination of fatigue, hunger, illness, and strict discipline could push a crew to the breaking point. A successful mutiny could overthrow a captain in moments, leaving him powerless and in danger of death or imprisonment. The knowledge that such a possibility always existed added to the mental burden. Every decision had to anticipate the crew's reactions, and the captain needed constant vigilance to detect early signs of unrest. The mental endurance required to manage all these responsibilities cannot be overstated. A captain's day often began long before sunrise and continued past sunset. He supervised navigation, oversaw the crew's work, coordinated repairs, and addressed disputes. Nights were often sleepless, with the threat of storms or attacks demanding immediate attention. Unlike ordinary workers, captains could not simply hand over tasks and leave. They were always accountable. Even after the voyage concluded, the burden continued. Captains faced scrutiny from naval authorities, admirals, and officials who reviewed their decisions, logs, and outcomes. Successes might bring praise and promotion, but failures could lead to disgrace, court-martial, or dismissal. Every choice made at sea was recorded and could later be judged in the cold, bureaucratic environment of naval command. The captain's reputation and career were constantly at stake, adding another layer of stress to an already demanding role. This constant pressure created a profound isolation. Unlike the crew, who could find comfort in camaraderie and shared experiences, the captain bore the ultimate responsibility alone. Officers could advise, but the final decision and the consequences belonged to the captain. He carried the weight of every misstep, every misfortune, and every loss. Even minor failures could haunt him, while major disasters could end his career or life. And yet, despite all these dangers and responsibilities, naval captains persevered. Their role demanded courage, intelligence, and extraordinary resilience. They were required to anticipate threats that no one else could see, make split-second decisions with limited information, and maintain the trust and loyalty of hundreds of men in extreme conditions. Their success was often measured not in medals or accolades, but in the quiet relief of returning a ship and crew safely to port after months at sea. The captain's life was one of unending vigilance. He faced nature's fury, the threats of disease and rebellion, the perils of combat, and the relentless scrutiny of naval authorities. Every day was a test of skill, endurance, and leadership. And although history often celebrates heroic battles or famous explorers, the daily struggles and constant pressures endured by countless captains remain largely unseen. Ultimately, the captain's role in the 1800s was a life of extraordinary responsibility. It demanded not just knowledge of navigation, seamanship, and warfare, but emotional strength, moral judgment, and the ability to remain steadfast in isolation. He lived under pressure that few today could comprehend, constantly aware that every decision might mean survival or disaster, life or death. And this, above all else, is why the life of a naval captain during this era was so perilous, so exhausting, and so remarkable a role that required a man to be unyielding, vigilant, and resilient in the face of relentless challenges that stretched across months, years, and thousands of miles of open, unpredictable ocean. Being a captain was not about adventure alone, it was about enduring the weight of responsibility that never lifted, no matter how calm the seas might appear. It was about making impossible decisions, carrying the lives of others in one's hands, and emerging from every voyage alive and unbroken, a feat so extraordinary that most people could never hope to survive even a single day in that role.